Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 242, Spanish Recovery. We ended last time with La Noche Triste, the Night of Sadness. Cortés and his men tried to break out of Tenochtitlan on the night of June 30th, 1520, but they were discovered. Before long, Cortés found himself fighting for his life, the riches of Mexico a distant afterthought. Only about half of all the Europeans in Tenochtitlan made it out alive. All the gold meant for Charles V was lost. But more importantly, Cortés's plan to bring the Mexican Empire into the Castilian world under Charles V crashed and burned. If Cortés was going to justify his expedition, which he still needed to do, then he was going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out a different way to crack Tenochtitlan. This time, the Spanish takeover would not be peaceful. But before Cortés could even think about going back to the Central Valley, he needed to regroup and recover. The European defeat on the bridges of Tenochtitlan was the largest setback up to that point by Europeans in the New World. The Mexica, of course, didn't know that. But when they placed the bodies of the Europeans side by side, thinking they looked like, quote, white maize ears, they really believed they had seen the last of the Europeans. Those who had captured important European prisoners were rewarded as usual. They were allowed to cut their hair in a special way, signifying their status. Those who had captured a prisoner single-handedly would have their faces painted red at a special ceremony. The Mexica cleaned up their temples, set their idols back in place, and tried to settle back into their lives. The Spanish might look back on the evening as La Noche Triste, but to the Mexica, this had been a night of triumph. What we do not know was how important the Mexica considered a sacrifice of the Europeans they captured. Certainly, we know any Tlascalans captured were prized. Regardless, all the men captured that night were ritualistically sacrificed. Typically, prized captives had their heart removed and placed in a ceremonial offering dish called the Eagle Bowl, and the captor was allowed to consume some of the thigh of his captive. There was actually a whole order as to who got to eat what part if multiple people were involved in the capture. The first person got the right thigh, the second the left thigh, the third the right upper arm, the fourth the left one, the fifth the right forearm, and the sixth the last. Their heads then would be on display in a ceremonial skull rack. So, for that matter, were the horses' heads. The Mexica, for their part, would not have pitied these Europeans. According to tradition, they would become, quote, companions of the eagle, end quote, who would for 4 years sit in attendance on the sun itself. Despite the air of triumph, the damage caused to the Mexican Empire by the conquistadors had been immense. The unquestioning loyalty of the Mexica people to the emperor, for example, was done. The subject peoples on the coast had rebelled with astonishing enthusiasm. There were no doubts about getting any more tropical products from the Totonacs. Most of the nobility, the priesthood, and the warrior class had all been murdered by Alvarado. Morale had been shaken by the success of a tiny number of conquistadors with their devastating new weapons. 2 leading monarchs of the Triple Alliance, which, by the way, had managed the empire for years, had died violently, and much of the city of Tenochtitlan had been burned. The duty of trying to help the Mexica recover fell to their new king, Tlaxcala, Montezuma's brother. The good news was, while the Spanish were certainly formidable opponents, they were not gods. The Mexica had fought them on the bridges. They could fight them again if needed. The Spaniards could be beaten. They could be killed. Now, we have to imagine the celebration afterwards, as described thusly, quote, paths were adorned, the courtyard prepared, the ground leveled, reed tips were arranged and draped. Some plucked and removed the feathers from birds and dressed them, slew, singed, and dressed dogs, or prepared and cooked meat. Some ground and powdered tobacco with a heavy straw, filled tubes with it, that made tamales using dried grains of maize. They made white ones with beans, forming a seashell. Some mixed them into chocolate, some cooked stew and roasted chilies, end quote. Now this celebration that greeted the Mexica after the departure of the Spaniards wasn't particularly wise. The Europeans were hardly defeated. In fact, they were only several miles away, limping along. Tlaloc made no effort to pursue his defeated foe. He believed the Europeans were broken forever. He was wrong. Cortés was already regrouping. At the first place on land where the expedition rallied, beneath what became known as the Tree of Sorrows in Tacuba, Cortés made a clear speech to his injured army that he was not thinking for a moment of regarding the defeat on La Noche Triste as anything more than a tactical setback. With a tremendous show of calm, he insisted that he still proposed to deliver Tenochtitlan as a prize to the King of Spain. In the short run, the surviving Europeans would make for Tlaxcala and, as he hoped, recuperate there in the company of their allies. Now that his original plan of capturing the city without a fight was over, he would find an alternative, making more use of long resentful tributaries of the Mexican Empire. Now, even in those very first days after La Noche Triste, some kind of plan was developing in Cortés's mind. Clearly, the first night, he was downcast. He had with him about 400 men and 30 horses, nearly all of them wounded. The first night after the retreat, the Europeans rested a while in a temple at Odocalapo. Today, this is a church known as the Virgin of the Divine Assistance. Now, even though Tlaloc did not coordinate any attacks on the Europeans, different bands of Mexican warriors constantly harassed their enemy. The Europeans got what rest they could and set out again at midnight in the early hours of July the 2nd, 1520. Those capable of fighting were in the front and rear of the column, with the wounded in the middle. Their march on July the 2nd was a mere 5 miles. The expedition stopped at the hilltop town of Teotihuacan, where they were warmly received. The people there had been conquered by the Mexicans in the 1430s and had consistently suffered since. The men received food and the horses fodder. But this support was as psychologically heartening as it was materially beneficial. From there, they marched on to a town called Otumba on the northeast side of the lake. Now, here at last, Tlaloc decided that he would try to crush the Europeans once and for all. He mounted a large force and gave chase. He didn't commit himself to commanding the army, but gave that over to his deputy. The battle that was fought at Otumba was exhausting for the Europeans. As usual, the Mexica, with their obsidian blade swords, fought to capture and not kill, so there were very few Castilian fatalities. But the sheer numbers of the Mexica tired the already wearied ranks of Cortés's army. They fought hand-to-hand for hours. The small band of surrounded Europeans seemed to have no chance of breaking out. One observer wrote, "Truly, our enemies were innumerable, and we could resist but feebly." Cortés said, quote, "Since we were all tired, nearly all of us wounded, and fainting from hunger," end quote. By about noon, after several hours of constant fighting, Cortés perceived that his men were about to collapse. One man recalled, quote, "Our spirits were low," end quote. A decisive action was necessary if the entire expedition wasn't going to come to an end right then and there. Cortés provided it. He had seen for a while in the distance a couple of Mexican captains in glittering feathers. Contemporary accounts don't tell us exactly what they were wearing, but they were resplendent. Leaving a deputy in command of the infantrymen, Cortés took 5 horsemen to attack this group with lances. They rode at and through the undisciplined ranks and overwhelmed and surprised the leaders. Mexican war costumes, cumbersome as well as heavy, were designed to overawe. But these things really had no effect on the Europeans. The lead commander was knocked to the ground by Cortés, while one of his compatriots killed the man with his lance. It was the loss of this standard, as much as even more the loss of the leader, which counted against the Mexica. Now, this was partly due to psychological effect, but also because without a battle standard, Mexico didn't know which way to go anymore, and the disappearance spelled confusion. Leaderless and unable to communicate, the Mexican ranks broke. The Mexica lost this battle because they were badly organized and still hadn't figured out a way to deal with mounted troops in an open terrain. The Mexica, in fact, had been mere inches from inflicting a devastating final defeat on Cortés. Had Cortés lost at Otumba, his expedition would have been wiped out and he would be a footnote to history. And as a result, Otumba is always ranked amongst the most important of Cortés's victories. Frankly, though, if anyone or anything deserves credit for the victory, it would be the Spanish horse. If there was a statue commemorating the victory, the statue should be of the horse, not Cortés. The Mexican defeat at Otumba allowed Cortés to continue his slow march back towards Tlaxcala. Now, back in Tenochtitlan, the result of the Otumba defeat was that 2 factions rose around Tlaxcala. One was a militant faction that wanted to declare war on any group that had or was aiding Cortés. The other was what you might call the appeasement party. They wanted to give the Europeans whatever they wanted on the conditions that the Europeans not return. Ultimately, the militant wing won out. As a result, several of Montezuma's old friends and family, including several of his children, were put to death. In the meantime, on July the 9th, 1520, the conquistadors crossed the mountains back into the kingdom of Tlaxcala. The army was still nursing its wounds when Cortés issued one of his least popular orders. He ordered everyone in the expedition who possessed any gold to turn it over. The reason was simple. The expedition was flat broke, and it needed the gold to purchase new allies. Still, the order was not popular, and we do not have any indication how successful it was. When Cortés reached Tlaxcala, he found out just how far his star had fallen. Sure, the Tlaxcalans were still willing to help him. They hated the Mexica, after all. But their support would come with a steep price. Specifically, they had 4 conditions. 1, they wanted Cortés to guarantee to hand over the city of Cholula to them. 2, they wanted to be able to garrison a special fortress within Tenochtitlan itself. The Tlaxcalans believed this would protect them from any attacks by the Mexica in perpetuity. 3, they wanted to divide any spoils evenly. 4, they wanted perpetual freedom from paying tribute to whoever was ruling from Tenochtitlan. Cortés, not really having any choice, agreed to all their terms. Now, in the long run, These guarantees would do the Tlascalans very little good. Cortés and his expedition remained in Tlaxcala for 20 days, recovering from their wounds. Back in Tenochtitlan, Emperor Tlaloc announced that he would remit all tribute for 1 year from any town which killed the Europeans or expelled them from their territory. Now, in addition to this, Cortés was facing 4 other major problems. First, he had to send back a messenger to Veracruz, asking for new soldiers and supplies. He had to be really careful about this message. It was crucial that he not spook the men remaining. If they refused to come, or worse, assumed the cause was lost and sailed for Cuba, then he was doomed. He needed to get new men without acknowledging how badly he had been defeated. Second, Cortés received word that a party of sick and wounded men whom Cortés had just sent on to Veracruz while he was recovering in Tlaxcala, those too sick or wounded to campaign at all, had been ambushed. Everyone had been killed. Most importantly, all the supplies and a lot of Mexican silver was lost. Third, Cortés had to deal with the commander who had been in Tlaxcala during La Noche Triste. This man, Juan Paez, had continued to sit in Tlaxcala long after the situation in Tenochtitlan had grown dire. The Tlaxcalans had offered to march with him to Tenochtitlan to the aid of Cortés, reportedly with 100,000 men. But Paez refused. Cortés strongly reprimanded him now, but it wouldn't be the last time Paez would be accused of being a coward. Finally, of the remaining 300 or so men, many now began agitating for a return to Cuba. No doubt, most of this believed that they were just lucky to have survived La Noche Triste. They had zero intention of rolling the dice again. These men were tired and afraid. They were in a strange land, surrounded by enemies. They made the following written demand to Cortés. Quote, "Very magnificent sir, the captains and soldiers of this army, of which your excellency is general, appear before you and say to you that the deaths, damages, and losses which we have suffered while in the city of Tenochtitlan, whence we have just come, as well as on the road from there, are all well known to you. Most of our men and horses are dead. The artillery is lost, our ammunition is exhausted, and we are lacking in everything with which to carry on the war. In addition, in this city, where we seem on the surface to have been given a good reception and shown goodwill, we have found for certain that they are trying to reassure us with pretended words and deeds in order to lull us into a false sense of security. And then, when we least expect it, they will attack us and finish us off. We cannot believe that these Indians will keep faith or promises with us, nor go against their own people and their neighbors in our defense. The enmity and war between them in the past will turn to friendship and peace, so that together they may be more powerful against us and so destroy us. Of all this, we have seen and understood the beginnings. Besides, we see that your excellency, our leader in general, is badly wounded. The surgeons say that your wound is dangerous, and they fear you may not survive. All these things, if your excellency will examine them, afford good reasons for us to abandon the city and not wait for a worse conclusion to our affairs than exist at the present. We are also informed that your excellency, without taking into consideration the urgent and sufficient reasons to put a stop to the conquest, intends to go ahead and continue the war, a plan which, if put into effect, will lead to our destruction. We therefore ask and beg your excellency, and if necessary demand, that you leave this city with all the army and set off for Veracruz, so that what is most to the service of God and His Majesty can be determined best." End quote. Cortés responded with his usual bravado. He, quote, said that to show the natives, especially those who are allies, that we lack courage would turn them against us the sooner after all. Fortune always favors the brave. Furthermore, we are Christians who trust in the great goodness of God, who will not let us perish utterly, nor allow us to lose such a great and noble land, which has been or is in the service to your majesty. Nor could I abandon so great a service to the great Charles V. As, continuing the war, I determined, therefore, that I would go on no account, go across the mountains to the coast. On the contrary, I told them that, disregarding all the dangers that work I might lie ahead of us, I would never abandon this land, apart from being shameful to myself and dangerous for you all. It would also be a great treason to the majesty Charles V. I resolved to fall on our enemies wherever I could and oppose them in every possible way, end quote. It was a straightforward appeal to the men's sense of honor. Cortés knew his countrymen well. He knew what buttons to push to keep them going. As usual, it worked. The rebellion simmered but didn't boil over. But Cortés wasn't going to take any chances. Immediately, he began planning a new campaign. Idle hands, after all, are the devil's playthings. This campaign, though, would not strike at Tenochtitlan, at least not immediately. Cortés had something else in mind. He would strike at the province of Tepeca. Tepeca was a hilltop fortress and the center of tribute for the region for Tenochtitlan. For a century, it had resisted incorporation into the Mexica Empire and had only recently become a dependency. It was a crucial source of both foodstuffs and cotton for the Mexica. Plus, Tepeca lay in the middle of the best route from Tenochtitlan to Veracruz. If Cortés could liberate the region from Mexica control, then he could deprive Tenochtitlan of one of its most important vassals, while simultaneously protecting his route of escape. There were other reasons that Cortés chose Tepeca as his target. The Tlaxcalans really wanted him to attack it, and the alliance really mattered to Cortés at this point. Moreover, it would be devastating to morale in Tenochtitlan to lose Tepeca. And, to top it off, he needed a distraction, a common enemy, to fully incorporate Narvaez's men fully into his army. Hence, after a 20-day rest, Cortés's army moved toward Tepeca on August 1st, 1520. Cortés could not take all of his men. Some were still too wounded to fight. The Tlaxcalans, however, had more than made up the difference. They contributed several thousand warriors to his cause. Tepeca is only 40 miles from Tlaxcala, so Cortés reached the edges of its territory after only 4 days at the small town of Axinco. Cortés sent his messengers ahead, requiring the Tepecans to explain their attitude toward the Europeans. In other words, Cortés wanted to know, are you with us or against us? The Tepecans sent a defiant reply, so 2 days later Cortés attacked. The battle was completely one-sided. European firearms, horses, and the ferocious Tlaxcalan warriors were all too much. In the end, about 400 Tepecans were killed. Cortés moved into the center of the city, and there Tepeca offered its submission and allegiance to Charles V on September 4th, 1520. Cortés on this occasion was especially brutal after the battle. Breaking with his previous practice, he enslaved all the wives and children of every man who had been killed in battle. These people were sold for 10 pesos each, branded on the cheek, and became slaves in the European sense. For the first time ever in Mexico, Cortés declared that the children of any enslaved woman would become a slave. Property, and therefore wealth, suddenly recreated itself. This is a story that will come to dominate the Americas, but I'm guessing you already knew that. Cortés then set about conquering the entire province around Topeka. His treatment of all those cities and towns was the same. This campaign was one of the most brutal, but also one of the most important of Cortés's time in Mexico. By winning this campaign, Cortés cut Tenochtitlan off from the sea to the east, won over half of what is today Mexico, and severed the Mexica ties with the tropical regions to the south. In a report detailing these events, Cortés himself admits to the atrocities, quote, "When we crossed the border into Topeka, that is, into the Mexican Empire from Tlaxcala, many of the natives came out to fight us and defend the road as best they could from strong and dangerous positions. Not to give an account of everything which befell us in this battle, which would take too much time, I will only say that, after we had completed our demands for peace on your Majesty's behalf, and with which they had not complied, we made war on them, and they fought many times against us. With the help of God and royal fortune good of your Majesty, we always routed them and killed many without killing or wounding a single Spaniard, and within 20 days we had pacified and subdued many towns and villages, and the lords and chieftains had come forward and offered themselves as his Majesty's vassals. I have driven from those provinces many of the Mexica who had come to help the people of Topeka make war on us, to ensure they did not become our allies. In a certain part of this province, where they killed 10 or 12 Spaniards, the natives have been very warlike. I made certain of them slaves, of which I gave a fifth part to your Majesty's officers, for they are all cannibals. I was also moved to take those slaves so as to strike fear into the Mexicans, and also because there are so many people over there that if I did not impose a great and cruel punishment, they would never be reformed." End quote. Meanwhile, Cuitlahua was doing his best to restore morale in Tenochtitlan and the overall strength of the Mexica Empire. The temples were repaired and the idols restored. Yet, very little of what was done was of a military nature. Many historians, and I do mean many, blame the final collapse of the old Mexican Empire on this lackadaisical attitude in the interim between La Noche Triste and Cortés's return. This really isn't fair for several reasons. First, they did do some things. The Mexica built new fortifications. They had longer spears fashioned to try and deal with the longer Spanish swords. Second, they didn't have any idea if or when Cortés was going to return. Third, they, much like the Byzantines, tried to use wealth and diplomacy to try to get someone else to finish off the Europeans. It wasn't necessarily their fault that none of these things worked. Cortés used the establishment of the base at Topeka as an opportunity to take stock of his legal position. He wrote a lengthy report to send back to Spain. Essentially, the document blames Navarrete for the entire La Noche Triste debacle. Cortés argued that, because he was forced to leave Tenochtitlan, everyone messed things up in his absence. He's not wrong, per se. However, Cortés clearly downplayed his own role in appointing Alvarado in his stead, and then mismanaging affairs after he returned to the city. Cortés wrote another document to go along with this one, essentially a joint letter from the army, in which the army demands that Cortés be allowed to remain not just their military captain, but the official mayor of Veracruz. The purpose behind this letter was to forestall any additional European efforts to colonize the region and hence replace Cortés. These letters are unique for an additional reason. Cortés wrote that Charles V should think of himself as the emperor of what he calls New Spain. This is the first time that anyone, in writing, expressed the belief in a far-flung empire spanning multiple continents. Previously, most thinkers still wrote about Christendom as the overarching ideal. Cortés's suggestion that there might be a Spanish empire was truly novel at the time. Frankly, there wasn't really even such a thing as Spain yet. Spain is still Castile and Aragon, at least in terms of the beliefs of the people who live there. To suggest that Charles V might be the emperor of a new Roman Empire beyond the seas, that was quite the logical leap. While Cortés was defending his legal position through this series of letters, he was also preparing for a return to Tenochtitlan. Critically, Cortés ordered the construction of a series of small ships, which would change the balance of power on the lake. Cortés realized he needed to starve the Mexica into submission more than anything else. He couldn't do that while the Mexica controlled the lake. These ships would alter his position decisively. But by far and away, the biggest change to Cortés's situation in Mexico was way beyond his control. As I mentioned 2 episodes back, in 1518, a major smallpox epidemic began in Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. By late 1519, the plague spread to Cuba. Then, of course, Narvaez took the expedition and the epidemic to Cozumel. Historians cannot say for certain still today whether it was Narvaez and his expedition that ultimately landed smallpox in Cozumel, but after he left, smallpox decimated the population. Certainly, though, we are confident that it was Narvaez and his expedition that brought smallpox to mainland Mexico. Old Mexico didn't have any experience with viruses. The Totonac people were decimated. The Mexica, as it spread inland, had no clue how to respond. Most of the priests interpreted the new disease as a punishment from the gods, which by and large is how Europeans also still thought about disease. Mexican town after Mexican town was depopulated. In many streets, there was no means of collecting the corpses. Mexican officials, anxious themselves about catching the disease from the dead, more often than not, just leveled the dead person's house on top of them. Those who did not die were left scarred, physically and mentally. In many places, half of the population died. It was a worse epidemic than the Black Plague in the 14th century. Compounding problems, the deaths of so many laborers meant that there was no one to plant or harvest corn. There was no one to grind the maize. So starvation followed. By September of 1520, smallpox reached Chalco. By October, it was in Tenochtitlan. Worse still, the Mexica could not help but notice that while the disease killed thousands of them, it seemed to spare the Europeans. Hence, it certainly looked like the gods had sided with Cortés. Cortés, oddly, and I think really interestingly, didn't seem to grasp any of this. He didn't seem to understand how devastating the plague was on the Mexica people. He did notice, however, all the deaths in and around Tepeca. Because so many local chiefs died, Cortés got to play the role of kingmaker in the region, which only strengthened his personal grip. While thousands of Mexica died, Cortés continued consolidating his power. He dispatched his loyal lieutenant Sandoval to the north, where, for 30 days, he worked to pacify the region successfully. No doubt, he was aided more by smallpox than anything else. The success in the north of Tlaxcala had the same effect on the region as the wars waged to the south and west of Tepeca. Things were going so well, in fact, Cortés didn't hesitate when several members of Narvaez's expedition asked for permission to return to Cuba. Cortés figured he was better off without them. Around Christmas 1520, Cortés returned to Tlaxcala. He was in an infinitely better position than he had been 6 months prior. There he planned his strategy for the next phase of his grand campaign: how to reconquer Tenochtitlan. Cortés left about 60 men in Tepeca with a few cannons and a few horses. As for himself, he had bigger plans. It turned out that the Emperor Tlaxcala would never get a chance to face Cortés. He died of smallpox and was succeeded by his cousin Cuauhtémoc. Cuauhtémoc was in his mid-20s at the time. He was young, brave, and determined. Given the circumstances facing New Mexico, he was the perfect choice for the leader. Frankly, he was the only choice. Cuauhtémoc's mission was to fight. But to stand a chance against Cortés and the Tlaxcalans, he also needed allies. While he was seeking out allies, Cortés remained in Tlaxcala, planning his next move. Several new ships arrived in Veracruz that fall, bolstering his men and supplies. He now had 80 crossbowmen and arquebusiers, plus 40 horses. He had 8 or 9 field guns, though he was painfully short on powder. He had probably 550 infantrymen. Cortés, as usual, had his fairly small army supported by a massive number of Tlaxcalan allies. Numbers are hard to estimate. Cortés was offered 80,000 men. According to the records, he took 10,000. Still, that's 20 Tlaxcalan warriors for every European. So to argue that Cortés and a handful of Europeans brought down Old Mexico is simply not true. Cortés, a handful of Europeans, and thousands of Mesoamerican Indians brought down the Mexica. Though Cortés was setting out with a force similar in size, if maybe superior in quality, to that which he had gone to Tenochtitlan about 14 months previously, his strategy was now different. In 1519, he had hoped to impose his personality on Montezuma, and then use him as a puppet. Now, he planned to defeat Montezuma's successor in battle. But when he left for Tenochtitlan, Cortés's number one strategy to reduce the capital city remained incomplete. The ships were not finished. When Cortés left Tlaxcala for Tenochtitlan on the 27th of December 1520, they were still working on the vessels. So basically, Cortés's plan was to establish a base for him at Texcoco on the eastern shore of the Lake of Mexico, launch what forays he could, and wait for the ships to arrive. Cortés reached Texcoco on December the 30th, 1520. He was met by the lords of the city bearing banners of peace. They told him, quote, "Our lord and king sends to say you that he covets your friendship. He is waiting for you peacefully in Texcoco. The squadrons who have been waiting in the ravines to attack you on your way down, sent by Cuauhtémoc, have nothing to do with us." End quote. Cortés accepted the show of friendship, but both he and his captains believed that this was a ruse, and they camped 5 miles outside the city. They were wrong. The Europeans remained in Texcoco for about 4 days, and got nothing but a warm welcome. Most of the residents of Texcoco, however, left town, playing it safe. Everybody remembered how the Europeans had recently massacred a group of Mexica just for dancing. But Texcoco was not willing to try and dispatch the conquistadors. Now that the tables had turned on the Mexica, essentially everyone was jumping ship on their alliance. All Cortés had to do was ride the wave. At the end of the 4 days, 3 Texcocan lords came to see Cortés. They told him that in the past, when they had fought against him, it was because they were ordered to do so by the Mexica. Now they wanted to be on his side. From now on, they promised they would do everything he commanded. When Cuauhtémoc found out about these negotiations, he sent his own messengers. He told the Texcocan people to remain faithful, that the Europeans were sure to be defeated this time. The Texcocan lords responded by arresting the Mexican messengers and turning them over to Cortés. Cortés realized that his plan was working. If he continued to circuit around the lake, then he might be able to turn all of Cuauhtémoc's former allies against him. Then he could begin the siege from a superior position. So he set out on a reconnaissance mission around the lake. He started by going southeast. Now in 1519, when he arrived at Tenochtitlan, it had been on the northern side of the lake. So Cortés had not made any contact with any of the Mexica-dependent states to the south. His first target was the important town of Iztapalapa. Initially, Cortés intended to garrison the town. In the end, he didn't, and that decision proved to be providential. The Mexica opened a breach in one of the nearby dikes, flooding the town. Had Cortés and his men been inside, they might have drowned, which, of course, was the plan. As it were, they lost most of their gunpowder. When Cortés awoke, he found himself surrounded by water, with Mexican war canoes streaming down upon his position. He quickly determined his present position wasn't worth the cost in men to hold it, and fought his way back to Texcoco. Once again, the Mexica misinterpreted this as a sign that Cortés was defeated once and for all. The Mexica, culturally, never retreated from a forward position. But again, they didn't understand that Europeans saw battles differently. Again, it cost them. Once back in Texcoco, the lords of Chalco and Tamalanco sent word that they too would like peace with Cortés. Chalco was an especially important town, so this was great news for the Europeans. Every city that flipped to Cortés added manpower to his expedition and took defenders away from the Mexica. First, however, Cortés needed to defeat the Mexican garrison within Chalco. He dispatched his trustworthy lieutenant Sandoval, who fought several critical battles before re-establishing Chalco as an independent city, with no need to pay tribute to Mexico for the first time in 50 years. In a sign of things to come, Sandoval suffered no casualties. At the end of January, Cuauhtémoc was inaugurated as emperor. Immediately, he set about rebuilding the defenses around Tenochtitlan. He ordered canals deepened so that they couldn't be filled in. The Mexicans also prepared darts, long lances, and other weapons of war. Cuauhtémoc was more vigorous in his commitment to war than either of his predecessors had been. It's interesting to think about what might have been had he been in charge in the first place. But he wasn't. By the end of January, Cortés assumed the ships he had ordered would be ready, so he sent Sandoval to Tlaxcala to bring them to the lake. Sandoval left, but he hadn't made it very far before he met a party bearing the ships to Texcoco. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of these ships in the battles to come. It's sort of like the modern equivalent of getting powerful anti-aircraft systems to neutralize an opponent's aerial advantage. Just like Cortés was doing to Mexico's allies around the lake. Cortés was about to take a disadvantage and transform it into his favor. From Texcoco, Cortés set out for Tacuba. Tacuba was a member of the Mexican Triple Alliance, but it was the smallest member. Still, it held an important position due west of Tenochtitlan. In fact, it was along the causeway that connected Tacuba to the city that Cortés and his men had made their getaway during La Noche Triste. Tacuba, however, would not turn its back on the Mexica. The reality was that many of Tacuba's nobles had intermarried into the Mexican royal line, so they had too much to lose by supporting Cortés. Tacuba, in fact, had rebuilt the entire causeway Cortés had partially destroyed during La Noche Triste, a fact immediately apparent to him as he approached the town. Cortés spent 6 days around Tacuba, constantly fighting skirmishes and trying to get the lords of the town to switch sides. Ultimately, Cortés was unable to break the town and had to return to Texcoco. The reason he had to return, however, had a lot more to do with internal problems. Several men came to him with allegations that there was a plot to assassinate Cortés and replace him. The leader of the plot was Antonio de Villafana, who just so happened to be the brother-in-law of Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. Cortés, as usual, acted decisively. He went to Sandoval and explained what was happening. Sandoval gathered up what men he could and immediately arrested Villafana. Villafana was tried and hanged, all in the scope of about an hour. Cortés would later tell the men that Villafana had swallowed the list of his fellow conspirators before Cortés could get it. This is almost certainly false. If there was a list, and who carries around a list of their fellow conspirators, then Cortés definitely saw it. But he probably didn't need to. The men who had thrown in their lot with Villafana would have been easy to guess. They would all be people with connections to Governor Velázquez. And in the end, it didn't really matter. Most of the likely conspirators left for Cuba within a few weeks. Cortés was smart enough to appoint himself a bodyguard, however. On March the 15th, 1522, messengers arrived from Chalco that a large Mexican force was on its way. According to the message, it was 20,000 soldiers strong. Cortés was frustrated and dispatched Sandoval with a force to support their new ally. In the end, though, said force wasn't needed. Chalco defeated the Mexica on their own. If there was ever a sure sign that the days of old Mexico were numbered, this was it. Sure, the Mexicans could not seem to break Cortés and his European technology, but the fact that they could no longer defeat other Indians meant that the game was nearly over. And it's hard to tell exactly when this happened, but at some point around 1522, Cuauhtémoc himself gained the nickname of, quote, Falling Eagle, end quote, which is never a good nickname to have. So long as Cortés already had troops on their way to Chalco, he decided he would continue his circuit around the lake. By and large, this maneuver succeeded. From Chalco, Cortés went to the town of Cuyoacan, and from there to Cuernavaca, which he reached in mid-April. Ultimately, Cortés marched around the entire circuit of the lake, and the Mexica were powerless to stop him. Cortés fought a few engagements. The Mexica seemed to believe that they had fought off an attack, but Cortés was merely conducting a routine reconnaissance. The battle for Tenochtitlan was about to begin. As always, if you'd like more content, check out the website, link in the show notes. If you're interested in ad-free versions of the show, there's the Patreon page for that, link also in the show notes. And if you're interested, check out a free 7-day trial of Western Civ 2.0. We're deep into the Peloponnesian Wars at this point. If you'd like the whole thing over again, but with way more detail and better audio quality.